Well, my name is Reg Harrison, sometimes known as Crash Harrison, for I somehow survived 4 plane crashes. I was born and raised on a farm about 30 miles west of Melville. I didn't really have enough education to be a pilot, but fortunately for me, they opened what they call pre-enlistment schools in Regina. I went to Regina. I didn't have very much money, but I won a competition in the local beef and calf club. So I went with 3 other fellows to the Regina exhibition. While I was there, I went to the recruiting office, and they gave me a medical and then an aptitude test. Somehow I passed them both. I only weighed 118 pounds. And then the first pre-enlistment school started in October, and that's when I started we had to get through in 8 months, and if you finish the course, you got credit for grade 12 less 2 credits. But that was sufficient to start training as a pilot. 1942, they had a big crop, and my dad wanted me home to help with the harvest, so I got 6 weeks harvest leave. And when I came back, they told me I had to go to Virden, Manitoba for my elementary. And then they asked me where I wanted to go for my service flying. You can go to Brandon, Dauphin, or Yorkton. I hesitated and I said, well, I think I'd like to go to Yorkton. I really didn't tell them that it was close to the farm. I just said, well, if I got a 48-hour pass, it'd be a little easier for me to catch the bus or the train. So I ended up at Yorkton, and it was a very bad winter for blizzards and storms, and the fellows that I had hoped to go to elementary with the Regina ETFs, they just started their course in Yorkton, and they'd only been on it for about a week, so the instructors thought I could catch up to them, so I joined them, and I got my wings in the end of April in 1943, and then got 10 days embarkation leave, and then went overseas. Left Halifax. We went on the Louis Pasteur, and that took us about 4.5 days. The convoys took about a month. They all go to Bournemouth to the reception center. There are thousands of them there. I went to Church Lawford to a BAT course, beam approach training. I often wondered why we were taking Morse code at Yorkton, but I found out there that we needed the Morse code to complete the beam approach training. And you'd only use that if you were going to land on Fido. That was if the aerodromes were fogged in. That course lasted about 10 weeks. And then I was posted to Ossington, OTU, where we flew Wellingtons and was there for about 4 months. And then we went to a conversion unit where they were flying Halifax 5s with the Merlin inline engines. And that course only lasted 3 weeks. We got a total of 15 hours flying. We had to do a cross country about 4.5 hours, same at night, a few circuits and bumps, and then they told us, well, when you get posted to a squadron, just hope you don't get posted to Croft, because that has the reputation throughout Bomber Command known as the Jinx Station. When we got word they're posting, what do you know, we got posted to Croft. And as it turned out, for me, it was a Jinx Station. We got there on March the 12th, 1944. On March the 15th, there were 5 crews arrived that day. They said, okay, all the pilots are going on their second dicky trip. And one of the chaps came up to me and he said, I know so-and-so, do you mind if we switch planes? And I said, it doesn't matter to me, I don't know any of them, you'll have to go and talk to the flight commander, which they did. And he said, no, you can arrange it yourself. So I went with a flying officer, Philbin. And Unbeknownst to the crew, they brought back a 500-pound bomb. And they didn't know it was there. I suppose over the target it was rather dark in the bomb bay. And the bomber hadn't seen the bomb. And although the bombing switch had been turned off, the bomb should not have been alive, but apparently it was. And just as when we were coming into land, I was standing beside the pilot, and he told me to go back to the crash position. Well, I didn't really go. I stepped back so he couldn't see me. And after he'd landed, slowing down, we were just going to turn off the runway, and the bomb fell through the bomb doors. We didn't hear it. It exploded, and it blew the aircraft apart. There wasn't anything left of the aircraft from the wings to all the fuselage was gone. The undercarriage was gone. All the tail section was gone. And the two gunners were in their turrets. They were both killed instantly. And in a Halifax, you're actually 26 feet off the ground. So I don't know what my trajectory was, because we never heard the bomb. And I guess when I don't know, it was a concussion from the bomb, but I don't remember hearing anything. But I don't know whether I went straight up in the air. I don't know what my trajectory was, but when I opened my eyes, I looked up and I thought I could see stars, which I really could because it was still dark. And my first thought was, God, I must be in heaven. And then I felt my uniform getting wet, and I thought, oh my God, I must be bleeding to death. Well, it wasn't that, but all the gas lines had been punctured from the bomb explosion, and the 100-octane gas was pouring out of the lines. And as soon as it hit the exhaust, burst into flames, and then the gasoline on the ground all caught fire. I started to run. I hadn't gone very far, and I tripped. I looked down, and here I tripped over someone's head, and he didn't have a helmet on, and he had a massive curly hair, blonde hair. I picked myself up, and I heard somebody yell, and apparently the pilot was halfway out of his cockpit, but his flying boot was stuck, so we wanted to help to pull him out, so we both pulled him out. And then the oxygen bottles started to blow up in the very cartridges. And we went to the hospital, and they said, oh, you've got a scrape on your arm, so you better go on leave. I went on leave I was only there on 3 days, and my uncle, who survived the First World War, he wanted to look at my arm, and he said, by Jove, I don't like the look of that. You better get out. I was in Hull. Next to London, it was the most bombed city in Britain. And the medical officer looked at it, and he said, by Jove, he said, you've got a phosphorus burn there. You better get to a burn hospital. So to make a long story short, they sent me to Basingstoke, and of course they didn't have time to treat me there, and I ended up at East Grinstead. And I was there for 10 weeks getting skin grafts done. And then when I got back to the squadron, I figured, well, I'll have another pilot for my crew, but they were still there waiting for me. I suppose they figured I'd be back any time, but I was away for 10 weeks. And we went to one cross country, and then we started on our ops. Everything went fine until the 13th trip, and we were going out to the plane, and my rear gunner, the youngest in the crew, said, he was very quiet, and I said, what's the matter, Kenny? Don't you feel good? And he said, well, Skipper, he said, I'm not really sick, but he said, do you know what trip this is? And I said, yeah, it's 13. Don't you like that? And he said, no, I really don't. He said, can we call it 12A? And I said, sure, we'll call it 12A. It won't be 13. I don't know whether he had a premonition or not, but just prior to liftoff, the starboard engine quit. And before I realized it, we were off the runway, and it was pitch black. Aircraft over there had no navigation lights on. It was real dark. I didn't know if I was about 85 miles an hour. I didn't know if I could stop before I hit the other aircraft. They were still on the marshalling track. I was the fifth aircraft off out of 20. So I shoved the throttles through the gate. Of course, when I did that, the port wing went up like this, and the aircraft was in this position. But I staggered over the aircraft were full loaded with bombs, and then the aircraft stalled. I don't remember anything after that, but there was a farmhouse just off the airdrome. It had a stone wall around it, and we hit the stone wall, and my bomb aimer who was standing beside me, he went forward into the instrument panel and had a serious brain injury, and they took us to a trauma hospital about 50 miles away. I woke up almost the time they got to the hospital, and Gordon died on the operating table. So that was the second trip. And the third trip, well, it's a long story too, but we had to bail out. My wireless operator missed a diversion message, and we ended up bailing out in Cumbria. Of course, it was sparsely populated, so the aircraft crashed, and the farmer's wife, she decided she was going to go out there. She got on the quad. She said, I stuck my hand in rabbit holes, and she said, these are the things I found. And she took them home, spread them on the kitchen table, and said, this is what I found. They were all pieces of the aircraft, and I still have those pictures, and I thought how close I came to being there because I got tangled up in the levers in the aircraft when I went to bail out. That was my third crash. It was the second crash for the crew. We were at the Central Medical Board for 3 days. I'd never heard of psychiatrists and psychologists, but when they got the report back, they said 5 members of the crew are no longer fit to fly, but we'll give them credit for a tour after doing 17 trips. But you and your rear gunner, if you want to continue to fly, you can convert to Lancasters. And so I said to Kenny, well, what do you think, Kenny? Should we go back with the boys or should we convert to Lancs? He said, oh, God, Skipper, he said, if the rest of the fellows know that we can still fly and we don't fly, they'll think we're cowards. And I said, oh, God, that won't be any good. So I told the Wing Commander Mitchell that we were going to convert to Lancs. He said, well, we got lots of orphan crew members here. I'll soon get you another crew. And he said, I hope you get better luck this time. Well, the very first trip we did on a Lancaster, here didn't we get diverted to the airdromes all in Yorkshire were all fogged in. We had to land on Fido. And that's where the airdromes, they only have 3 in England, and they have pipes on either side of the runway with holes in them. They pump 100-octane fuel through them, set fire to them, and then the heat from the disperses the fog up to 700-800 feet. But you have to find the runway, and you do that by using the beam approach. And that was in Morse code. And when I went to turn on the machine, it wasn't in the same place as Halifax. And finally, I found it, and then I couldn't remember what the signals were, so they kept calling from a control tower, wanting to know where I was. Of course, I didn't know where I was in a circle, but finally, I think more by luck than good management, I finally got lined up with the runway. Landed, stayed there for breakfast, got back to base, and Wing Commander Mitchell called me, and he said, well, Crash, he said, doesn't look like your luck's changed. He said, so you've shaken hands with the Grim Reaper about 4 times. And I got a feeling you're not going to be lucky the 5th time. So he said, I'm going to screen you. Wing Commander Mitchell at Harrison's had some hair-raising experiences. I concur that he should cease his flying operations. If he wants, he can join a special duty squadron. So that was the end of my operations. And then I came home on about the end of January 28th. My wife was engaged to one of my best friends, Buddy Holloway. Every time Buddy would write to Jean, they were engaged. They were high school sweethearts. He'd say, okay, he'd call me Harry. Okay, Harry, he said, put a footnote on this letter. I'm writing to Jean. I'd always say, Buddy, I don't know Jean. I don't know what to say to her. He said, well, say something. And every time he'd write to her, he insisted that I put that on. And he always said, you never know. Someday you might meet her. Well, poor old Buddy, he never even got to the squadron. He was at the conversion unit, the same one that I was at, and his engineer had both port engines running from the same fuel tank, and they both stopped at the same time. And he was just going to come into land, and the weather had turned bad, and it was rainy, and he overshot the runway and went to go round again. The aircraft crashed into a house, and he was killed instantly, and along with his bomb aimer and I think the engineer. The others were badly burned, but they were pulled out from the wreckage. So I wrote to Jean and told her how sorry I was, and I said if I survived the war, I'll call and see you. Well, when we got to Lachine, Quebec, on my way home, I wired my folks and told them when I'd be in Melbourne. I had already decided I wasn't going to go and see Jean because I really didn't know what to say to her. I'd never had such an experience. So it was a Saturday, and when the phone rang, it was her sister, Angela, and she said, "Oh, when would you be arriving in Ottawa?" I said, "Well, I won't really have time, Ange." I said, "I've wired my folks. I told them when I'd roughly be in Melbourne, so I won't have time." She said, "Well, Jean's going to be disappointed. She wants to talk to you about Buddy." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to make it." So I hung up the phone. Then some little voice said to me, "You know, Harrison, that's pretty selfish of you. Your good friend Buddy, he never gets this squadron. He gets killed in the very first crash he's in. You survived 4 of them. The least you can do is go and see Jean." So I got up enough courage to phone back, and Jean, by this time, she was home, and she said, "Oh, my sister told me you weren't going to have time to call." And I said, "Well, I've changed my mind, Jean. I'm going to call." She said, "Well, when will you be arriving in Ottawa?" I said, "I have no idea." I said, "There's hundreds of people here. It'll take them several days to sort us all out. But," I said, "I'll let you know when the train's ready to leave here." Of course, it had several stops. It had to stop in Montreal and other places. When we got to Ottawa, I'd never been in that station before, but they had big marble pillars, and the place was full of airmen. They were greeting one another, and finally, and I'm sitting on my kit bag, and I brought my flying boots back with me. My uncle gave me a nice little leather case. I looked across, and I saw 2 women, and looked like they were looking at a picture, and I thought to myself, you know, that might be Jean and her sister looking for me. So I got my kit bag, I dragged it across the floor, and I came to them and I said, "Are you ladies looking for someone?" They said, "Yeah, we're looking for Flight Lieutenant Harrison." "Oh." I said, "I'm a flight lieutenant. My name's Harrison. Maybe you're looking for me." Well, that's how we met. And Buddy said, "You never know, someday you might meet her." I was going to stay 2 days, and I stayed 4. I went back that summer for 2 weeks, and then the following December we got married. And my 3 daughters often say, "Dad, if you hadn't listened to that little voice, we wouldn't be here, would we?" You know, I often think, fellas, if Buddy was so emphatic, every time he'd say that, he would say, "You never know. Someday you might meet her." I've often wondered if he had a premonition he wasn't going to come back. Just like my rear gunner had a premonition that he didn't like number 13. Being a veteran and being involved in a war, Remembrance Day means a lot to me. And I can well remember my dad. He had 3 brothers in England. They were all in the British Army. And of course, he decided he was going to go and join them. So in 1915, he joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And he survived the war along with his youngest brother. His other two brothers didn't make it, and for some reason, they named me after the 2 that never made it. But I can recall my dad. We didn't have very much money, but during the 30s, there was a little church about 7 or 8 miles away, and he would always go on November the 11th, along with several other veterans in the surrounding district, and they never miss attending one of those services. So that sort of set the tone for me and I. Although I came back and started working in Regina in 45 with the Veterans Land Administration and got transferred to Saskatoon in 47, January 47, I think I only missed one Remembrance Day. Why it's important to me, because we live in a free country, and majority of Canadians, I think they just sort of take it for granted, not realizing, at least a lot of them don't realize, that a very heavy price was paid. Some people really, it's a holiday for them. That's all it means to them. But for people that lost loved ones, they have more than one Remembrance Day in a year. When their loved one has a birthday, or they gather as a family gathering for Christmas or some other occasion, they often think of, well, what if so-and-so had come back? I wonder what he would have done. Would he have been a history teacher? Would he have been this or whatever? And I think that's why it's so important that even though it only happens once a year, it reminds people, or it should remind people, what a heavy price was paid by all those who volunteered to go to war so that those that were left behind could continue to live in a free country. I'm so damn lucky to have survived those 4 crashes, and so many of my friends went missing, and so many of them, they have no known graves. The Runnymede Memorial north of London has 18,000 names of veterans with no known graves. And I often think that those families must wonder how their loved ones died, what their final thoughts were, and where they're buried. To me, Remembrance Day, it conjures up a host of thoughts.